In 1608, at the age of 25, an officer in the service of the King of Bohemia had his horoscope cast by Johannes Kepler. Like most of his contemporaries, he believed the position of the planets and stars at birth shaped a person's character and that the zodiac held clues to one's fate. Because the officer used an intermediary, Kepler did not know whose life he was describing. Even if he had, the name would have meant little. Albrecht von Wallenstein was still years away from fame and fortune. Born at 4:36 p.m. on September 24, 1583, Wallenstein was a Libra. Kepler's interpretation sketched an unsettling portrait. The subject was alert and lively, eager and restless, hungry for novelty, impatient with ordinary human behavior, and drawn to new, untried, or extraordinary ways. Taciturn and melancholy, he seemed to possess what Kepler called a bent toward alchemy, magic, and enchantment. Communion with spirits, along with scorn for social rules and a deep suspicion of religion, treating much proposed by God or man as something to be questioned, even despised. Kepler went further. The subject, he warned, would be unmerciful, lacking brotherly or matrimonial love, caring for no one, devoted only to himself and his desires, severe toward subordinates, parsimonious, covetous, deceitful, inequitable in dealings, usually silent, often impetuous, belligerent, and fearless. It was not an attractive profile. And yet Kepler offered hope. Most of these flaws, he suggested, would soften with maturity. So unusual a nature might be capable of important deeds. Great ambition and thirst for power would create enemies, but in most instances the subject would be able to defeat them. Wallenstein was deeply impressed. He kept Kepler's horoscope close, comparing major events in his life with the predictions. Born and raised a Protestant, he converted to Catholicism at 23, more cynically than devoutly. He lacked serious religious conviction. His faith was in the stars. Throughout his life, he would consult astrologers, making important decisions only after the heavens had been read for him. Making a name for himself. 3 years after his conversion, Wallenstein's Jesuit confessor arranged his marriage to an elderly Czech widow who possessed vast estates in Moravia. Her convenient death a few years later left the young officer not only comfortable, but positioned for advancement useful to Ferdinand II of Bohemia. When Ferdinand appealed for help in his war against Venice in 1617, Wallenstein raised and trained a force of 260 cuirassiers and musketeers with money from his own pocket. Leading his cuirassiers on horseback, he broke through an enemy line encircling a fortress loyal to Ferdinand, whose defenders were near starvation or surrender. As the infantry held the breach open, Wallenstein arranged for the wounded and starving to be loaded into wagons and transported back to camp. The fortress was saved, and Wallenstein's military reputation was made. Then came the conflict later known as the 30 Years' War. It began as a rebellion by Ferdinand's Protestant subjects against their Catholic ruler, dramatically revealed when insurgents hurled 2 royal governors out a palace window in Prague in May 1618. They fell roughly 50 feet into a ditch and survived, but the challenge could not be ignored. This time Wallenstein financed an entire cavalry regiment. When Moravian subjects of Emperor Matthias joined the rebellion, Wallenstein was named a colonel in the Austrian army and sent against the very people whose lands had enriched him. He boldly seized the Moravian war treasury and delivered it to the emperor in Vienna, an act the Moravians considered treason. They confiscated his property and exiled him for life. It did not trouble him. At 36, Wallenstein was learning a brutal lesson. War did not only grant glory, it minted wealth for those who backed the winning side. He was about to become one of history's greatest wartime entrepreneurs. Wallenstein never expected Ferdinand or Matthias to repay the money he spent raising and training troops. What he wanted, what he received, was more valuable: titles, land, and the privileges that came with them. To the summit. At the Battle of White Mountain near Prague on November 8, 1620, Protestant forces were decisively defeated. Ferdinand, now emperor, named Wallenstein military governor of Bohemia and made him a partner in a syndicate authorized to issue coinage in Bohemia, Moravia, and Austria. As the new currency was reduced first to half, then to a third of its former value, Wallenstein began buying up estates of executed or banished Protestant noblemen. In rapid succession, he married into the emperor's inner circle and was named Duke of Friedland. He became the wealthiest man in the realm. To his contemporaries, Wallenstein appeared arrogant, sinister, tyrannical, the embodiment of Kepler's ominous horoscope. He was notorious for the command, "Let the brute be hanged," issued at the slightest provocation and carried out by fearful underlings. His temper became legend. On one occasion, it was said, he ran a sword through an officer who tried to deliver a message while Wallenstein spoke with his architect. Yet crushing the Bohemian revolt did not end the war. A new phase began in 1625, when King Christian IV of Denmark assumed leadership of the Protestant cause. Backed by the Netherlands, France, and England, Christian hoped to drive Ferdinand's Catholic League out of northern Germany. The emperor knew exactly whom to call. Wallenstein offered to raise and support an imperial army of 24,000 men. In return, he asked for the power to levy taxes and collect tribute from conquered lands. As commander-in-chief, he went from victory to victory over the next 3 years, forcing Protestant dukes to submit one by one. Meeting a challenge. Wallenstein's triumphs were not universally celebrated even among Catholics. Maximilian of Bavaria, for one, envied him and feared the independence Ferdinand gained through Wallenstein's success. When Wallenstein learned of the descent, he forced a showdown. If his command was not renewed, and if he was not granted authority to crush opposition with an army that would scourge Europe, he would resign. Despite Maximilian's fury, Wallenstein prevailed. He expanded his army to 70,000 men and was empowered to enforce an edict restoring to the Catholic Church property seized in Protestant lands, while outlawing all Protestant sects except Lutheranism. On May 22, 1629, Christian signed the Treaty of Elbeck, withdrawing from German affairs in exchange for the restoration of Danish lands. Among the abandoned Protestant allies were the Dukes of Mecklenburg, whose lands and titles were bestowed on Wallenstein. At the height of his power, Wallenstein no longer considered himself merely a servant of the emperor. He began to pursue an independent policy. An opposition takes shape. Campaigning in Denmark awakened him to the importance of sea trade and naval power. He secured appointment as leader of an imperial armada in the North and Baltic Seas and dreamed of founding a post-war trading company to rival England and the Netherlands. But after his siege of the Baltic port of Stralsund failed, the dream collapsed. Wallenstein's arrogance became a political weapon for his enemies. At an electoral diet in Regensburg in the summer of 1630, the princes demanded Ferdinand dismiss his general. Their grievances were many: the sheer size of Wallenstein's army, his practice of sustaining it by confiscating provisions across Protestant, Catholic, and neutral lands alike, arbitrary vengeance, cruelty, and what they called the barbaric, unchristian manner in which he enriched himself by impoverishing others. To save his imperial seat, Ferdinand yielded. On August 13, 1630, he agreed to Wallenstein's dismissal and replaced him with Count von Tilly, now 71, the victor of White Mountain and field commander for the Catholic League. The emperor's messengers delivered the news in Wallenstein's splendid military tent. They braced for an explosion. Instead, Wallenstein calmly pointed to a sheet of paper covered in astrological calculations. Bavaria's stars, he explained, were currently ascendant over Austria's. Maximilian was more powerful than Ferdinand. The emperor had no choice. He said nothing of what he believed would come next: a reversal of fortune and an inevitable recall. A Swedish march of triumph. Even as the electors met at Regensburg, the war entered yet another phase. Landing on Pomerania's Baltic coast, King Gustavus II Adolphus of Sweden assumed leadership of the Protestant cause. He was outraged by Catholic oppression, angered that his mediation had been rejected, wary of imperial maritime ambitions, and determined to restore the Dukes of Mecklenburg. Gustavus seemed invincible. He marched south, allied with Saxony, and met Tilly at Leipzig on September 17, 1631. The Swedes and Saxons, about 40,000 strong, defeated an imperial force of similar size. Afterward, the allies split. The Saxons moved into Bohemia, while the Swedes swept toward the Rhine. Panic gripped Ferdinand's court in Vienna. Once more, the indispensable general. Bitter over his dismissal, Wallenstein began plotting revenge against Maximilian and even Ferdinand. Starting in November 1630, he entered secret talks with Gustavus Adolphus. As he had done for Catholics, he offered to recruit and train an army at his own expense, this time for the Protestant cause. In return, he demanded extraordinary rewards, to be named viceroy over conquered domains, and support for his ambition to become king of Bohemia. Gustavus hesitated. However brilliant Wallenstein was, a turncoat was a dangerous ally. News of Wallenstein's offer reached Ferdinand. After Leipzig, the emperor swallowed his reservations and recalled his former commander. Wallenstein coolly promised an army of 40,000 men within 3 months on the condition his full powers were restored. When Tilly was defeated again and mortally wounded at the River Lech in spring 1632, Ferdinand had no choice but to accept Wallenstein's terms. The last campaigns. At first, Wallenstein was spectacularly successful. He swept the Saxons out of Bohemia and drove the Swedes north. By July 1632, he confronted Gustavus Adolphus at a fortified camp near Ehrenberg. For 11 weeks, he refused a decisive counterattack, though he easily repulsed Swedish assaults. Disgusted, Gustavus withdrew, and Wallenstein moved into Saxony. His brutal occupation weakened Sweden's allies and drove wedges among Ferdinand's opponents. On November 16, Gustavus finally forced battle at Elteen, attacking a slightly smaller imperial army. The Swedish cavalry commander and the king himself fell, but Wallenstein failed to press his advantage. The day ended in disaster for the Catholic forces. Had Wallenstein been defeated by the stars? As always before major battles, he had consulted an astrologer. The reading was unfavorable, and at this climactic moment, his faith overcame his nerve. The man whose first horoscope had promised a hunger for decisive deeds had become so dependent on astrology that he grew hesitant, fearful of action, intrigue, betrayal, and downfall. With his reputation tarnished, Wallenstein tried to reinvent himself as a peacemaker. To bargain between Ferdinand and Sweden, he needed control of his army, his leverage. He set up winter quarters in Bohemia and Moravia and once again demanded the population supply his troops. Ferdinand, alarmed, urged him to disband. Wallenstein convened a war council. His generals supported his refusal to comply. Ferdinand did not press yet began searching for a way to remove him. In 1633, Wallenstein remained largely inactive while the Swedes continued conquering, including the key fortress of Regensburg in November. All the while, Wallenstein negotiated secretly with enemies that now included France. Increasingly ruled by astrological readings, he offered contradictory terms to different parties. He lost credibility with both sides and became an object of distrust even among his own officers. On January 12, 1634, he coerced his generals into signing a pledge of support, though the crucial phrase, "so long as he remained in the emperor's service," was omitted from the document presented to them. When a general reported this to Ferdinand, the emperor issued a secret decree dismissing Wallenstein and naming Matthias Gallas as successor. Gallas received authority to arrest and, if necessary, kill the commander and any loyal officers. In mid-February, the decree became public. Wallenstein was accused of treason and stripped of lands and titles. With 3 loyal followers, Generals Trka, Illo, and Kinsky, Wallenstein left his camp at Pleas on February 22 and headed for the border, perhaps intending to join the Swedes. 2 days later, they reached the fortress city of Sheb, believing themselves safe. On the evening of February 25, the town commander invited the fugitives to a banquet at the castle. Trka, Illo, and Kinsky attended. Wallenstein remained behind and avoided the trap. The 3 unarmed guests were swiftly executed on orders of an officer loyal to Ferdinand. Then came the final question: what to do about Wallenstein? At p.m., with a snowstorm raging outside, an English captain named Walter Devereux and 6 dragoons forced their way into the commander's lodgings. They found Wallenstein standing near a window, perhaps searching the heavens for some last confirmation of fate. Devereux thrust forward with his halberd. Wallenstein pleaded for mercy. It was too late. The point drove through his chest, and he fell dead on the spot. All the princes and dukes, yes, everybody I have to turn into an enemy for the sake of the emperor, Wallenstein had said years earlier. That the emperor himself would become his enemy was something he had not anticipated or could not read in the stars. The persistent belief in astrology, the tradition of being guided by astrology, neither began nor ended with Wallenstein. Despite the scoffing of scientists, belief in horoscopes persists. Joseph Goebbels reportedly maintained an astrology office to support propaganda strategy. Indira Gandhi was said to consult a personal guru before major decisions. And 3 weeks before his fall, the Shah of Iran sought advice from a Jerusalem astrologer who, reading imminent collapse in the stars, declined the journey to Tehran. Cambodia's President Lon Nol relied less on generals than astrologers, and the most famous modern adherent was Nancy Reagan, whose belief became widely known after former White House Chief of Staff Donald T. Reagan described it in his 1988 memoir For the Record. According to him, her reliance on horoscopes and the influence it had on the president's schedule was among the most closely guarded domestic secrets of the Reagan White House. In 1981, San Francisco astrologer Joan Quigley convinced Mrs. Reagan that the assassination attempt of March 30th could have been predicted. After that, presidential appointments were reportedly shaped by favorable readings. Wallenstein would have understood. For some, the stars are not decoration. They are authority silent, distant, and irresistible.